Well, that holiday turned out to be a little bit longer than I anticipated. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be ranking the Jane Austen novels. I read these a while back now. I have actually had the script for this video down for a while, but after my extended break, I obviously haven't got around to doing it, so I'm going to kick things back up on the channel today by going through these wonderful books, because reading the Jane Austen novels was probably one of my best reading experiences ever, and certainly of this year. Before going into this, I think all of these novels are worth reading, so even if your favourite one comes at the bottom of my list, that doesn't mean it's a bad novel. I really don't think Jane Austen wrote a bad novel. Now, I am only focusing on her 6 major works because it's a nice number. They're all complete works, whereas her other things are either things she wrote early on and she didn't publish, and then obviously you have Sendition, which is her uncompleted final work, which I'm also not going to rank because it wasn't finished. So just focusing on these 6 masterpieces that she wrote and published. Kicking off our list of the worst of the best Jane Austen novels is Northanger Abbey. No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her born to be an heroine. Northanger Abbey is in part a parody of the Gothic novels at the time, specifically Anne Radcliffe's not famous novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho, and The Italian, both of which get referenced in this book, and certainly you can see that Austen is playing around with the themes and tropes of that genre, and also specifically those 2 books. Northanger Abbey tells the story of Catherine Morland, a young woman who is just up and coming in the world, and it's time for her to start meeting men, and so her parents send her to Bath in order to meet some of those men. She meets lots of interesting characters, some unsavoury ones, and some that she actually likes. She meets the charming but ultimately superficial Isabella and her boorish brother James. She also meets someone who she much prefers, which is a guy called Henry Tilney, whose father lives in the titular Northanger Abbey. In the second half of the novel, Catherine goes to visit the Tilneys at the Abbey, and her imagination, because she's been reading all these Gothic novels, starts to get the better of her, and she starts to imagine that she's actually in the plot of one of these Gothic novels that she loves so much. Now, Northanger Abbey is definitely a great novel to start with if you've not read any Austen before. It's very short, its themes are very light, and it's probably one of her funniest stories. It's a great parody of these classic Gothic novels, and while I certainly appreciated that I have now actually read The Mysteries of Udolpho and The Italian and other Gothic classics, and that allowed me to appreciate the parody even more, you don't really need to have read those novels in order to get the humour that Austen is going for here. We all know what the Gothic tropes are. You have the virtuous heroine who's very pure and all this, you have the scary murder, you have the big castle, you have the sometimes convoluted plots with sometimes supernatural elements in them. All of these things are just Gothic tropes that we all know, and some of us love them, I do, some of us hate them, but they're all to play for in this book, and Austen plays with them, but she's having fun. She doesn't come across as condescending to the genre, she just comes across as someone who probably read these books and probably enjoyed them. But she wants to play around with the tropes, she wants to have some fun, and she certainly does. However, the reason why this book comes at the bottom of my list is because it does have 2 relatively big shortcomings. First of all, the book is divided into 2 halves. We have the first half, which deals with Catherine as she goes to Bath and she meets all of the various characters. And it's a very interesting part of the book, full of classic Austen characters and tropes. The second half of the book deals with the Gothic parody. And again, a great Gothic parody it is, but these 2 sides don't really hang that well together. They just feel like 2 separate kind of short stories almost, that have a similar, obviously, thread with some other characters. So that's one thing that holds the story back for me. The other thing is Catherine Morland herself. Although she is a very funny and endearing heroine, she's not one of the most complex or deep characters in the world. And that's partly because Austen is ultimately parodying the Gothic genre a little bit here, and maybe it's just also that this is early in her writing, so she's not really got the mastery of character that she gets later on. I would also add that maybe, as someone who loves Gothic fiction, I do wish there was a little bit more of the Gothic in this book than there actually is, and so that's something that I also, purely for reasons of taste, is a reason why I don't like this book as much. Nevertheless, a great book, very entertaining, and like I say, if you're daunted by Austen, I think Northanger Abbey is a pretty good place to begin. Next up we have Sense and Sensibility. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Austen's first published novel follows the story of the Dashwood family and focuses on 2 of the sisters in that family, the extroverted and romantic Marianne and the practical and more shy and reserved Eleanor. Both of these characters complement each other wonderfully in their different sensibilities, And both of them have different elements of each other that cross over as well. It's not just a simple story of Marianne is sensibility and Eleanor is sense. Although that's certainly there, they both have elements of both of these character traits in them. It kind of reminds me a bit of Blake's poems, Songs of Innocence and Experience. Yes, there are two halves to that poetry collection, but you do find elements of the dark experience in the Songs of Innocence, and likewise you find some light and innocence in the Songs of Experience. It's a similar sort of thing that Austen is doing in this book. She's playing with that duality, those different personality types, and fusing them together in lots of interesting ways. The story mostly focuses on the love lives of Eleanor and Marianne after they are cast out of their previous home after the death of their father due to some inheritance nonsense, which means that their brother gets the house, and his brother's wife does not want those horrible women, in her opinion, hanging around, and so off they are sent, and they move in with some other relatives in a cottage that they have, and basically the story explores their love lives with a few men that come into the story. Marianne finds herself captured by the charming but ultimately rakish Mr. Willoughby, and Eleanor finds herself in love with Edward Ferrars, who is actually her brother's wife's brother, but he's much nicer than his sister. Now, what makes this story so wonderful to me, and one of the best parts, is the relationship between the two sisters at the heart of it. Although when I first read the story, I didn't find much in the two characters. I felt that they were just too much driven by the themes and not so much about the characters. On my second read, I actually changed my mind completely, and I really appreciate the bond between the two sisters. And it's probably Austen's best sister relationship, maybe within all of the books that she wrote. They have a very compelling relationship. You can tell that they love each other and they care about each other, but they're also willing to have arguments, have disagreements, and that causes a lot of the tension in the story. I also like the way that Austen explores the two themes of sense and sensibility through these two characters, but also through some of the side characters as well. She also doesn't draw any solid conclusions, although I would say that she probably comes down more on the side of sense than she does sensibility. I think at the same time she does also suggest that you need to be a little bit romantic. You can't always be practical and logical because it might also stop you from enjoying life. For example, Eleanor, because of her reserve, almost loses the man that she loves. I would also say it's not a bad book to start with for Austen either. That being said, if you do read it and you're underwhelmed by it a little bit, that's probably because there isn't, in my view anyway, something just unique that this novel has that none of Austen's other novels don't also give you. Of all of Austen's books, Sense and Sensibility to me seems like the most by numbers Austen, which is not a criticism, it's just that everything that I see in this book also happens in another one, and there's very little that I could say, okay, this is the book where this thing really stands out to me. The other books also have great sibling relationships in them. Other books also explore themes. All the stuff that Austen does is here, and it's just, done very well, very competently, but I just find that there's a spark missing from this book, and that's why it comes down lower on the list. That being said, it does have a little bit more depth than, say, Northanger Abbey, which is why it gets this spot for me. Next up, and perhaps controversially, we have Emma. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. So as the famous opening words of what many consider to be Austen's best novel suggest, Emma Woodhouse is a rich, powerful, contented woman, possibly a little bit spoiled as well, who's not really had any problems. And that is the character that we explore in this book. Someone who's a little bit spoilt, who thinks a little bit too highly of herself, and because of this, she gets herself into all kinds of terrible situations. Emma thinks that she's a wonderful matchmaker, and everyone that she sets up with other people doesn't tend to go very well. She also thinks she's a very good judge of character, and yet she also has a very consistent ability to make poor choices in her friendships. Ultimately, Emma is the story of a young woman growing up, realizing that she's not the brilliant mind that she thought she was. It's a very entertaining book. Emma is just an absurd character, and it's interesting that Austen thought that she was the sort of character that no one but her could like. And I can see why maybe she thought this, because Emma, on paper, she's not necessarily a great person to be around. Even the people who she claims to be friends with, such as her friend Harriet, who is a young woman whose parentage is unknown, and Emma takes her under her wing and tries to marry her off to a man of higher station. Even in this friendship with Harriet, Emma often displays a kind of superiority. She thinks she's a little bit better than Harriet, and she also thinks that Harriet is better than other people, such as the semi-working class, or I think he's merchant class, farmer that Harriet wants to marry. She often looks down on people who don't meet her standards, and ultimately she learns and grows as a character, but she's certainly not a very likeable character, but she is incredibly funny. There are lots of other funny characters in this story as well. I absolutely love Emma Woodhouse's father, Mr. Woodhouse, who is this impotent old man who is scared of every single thing. He refuses to go out, he's terrified of any kind of change in his life. He has some wonderful speeches. He's a bit like Mrs. Bennet, but but less kind of shrill and more just kind of pathetic and impotent. It's a very interesting and fun character, and also explains a lot why Emma is the kind of woman she is. She has so much reign and power because she has no brothers in the family, and her father cannot look after himself, so she has kind of taken on the traditional role of a man of the house. I would also say that Emma has one of the best romances between Mr. Knightley and Emma. What I like most about them is the way that they spar with each other and the way that they respect each other. You really get a sense that Mr. Knightley, even if sometimes he thinks Emma is a bit ridiculous, ultimately he respects her and he sees the potential that she has, and he always forgives her and always helps her on her path to maturity. This is certainly not an immediate novel, or at least it wasn't to me. On the first time that I read this, it was probably one of my least favourite Austen books. I just found the reading a bit so laborious for some reason. Now, when I did the second read through, that kind of went away a little bit, and I enjoyed it a lot more. And I think that of all of Austen's novels, maybe Emma is just one that needs to be read time and time again, and eventually maybe it will, improve in my eyes. But at the minute, there are still a few things that hold it back. One, like I said, it still seems a bit slow, at least in comparison to the novels that I'm yet to talk about. And I don't really know what else it is. I feel like it's just a book that I can appreciate all its merits. I can see why it's held up as the masterpiece or the culmination of everything that Austen does. And it's an author at her peak, and yet for some reason it just doesn't grab me in the way that the other books on this list really do grab me. But like I say, maybe this is something that will change when I reread it, because like I said before, it's a book that has gone up in my estimation every time I have reread it, so maybe I just need to do that a little bit more. Okay, now on to the top three. First up, maybe again controversially, we have Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Pride and Prejudice follows the story of the Bennet family. Mr. Bennet is the head of the family, and he is in a pretty precarious financial situation. Because Mr. Bennet only has 5 daughters, he lacks an heir, meaning that when he passes, his estate will go to someone else, and so it's very important for the Bennet family to marry these 5 daughters off. While Mr. Bennet ultimately seems to be quite absent and not all that bothered about his daughter's fates, Mrs. Bennet makes up for that in spades. She is a hysterical, crazy woman, hell-bent on getting her daughters married, and she will do anything and everything to make sure that it happens, including encouraging one of her daughters, Lizzie Bennet, to marry someone that she doesn't really like that much. Although there is the obvious main romance between Lizzie Bennet and Mr. Darcy, I think Pride and Prejudice does a lot more than just exploring Pride and Prejudice through these two characters and their interactions with each other. It also explores so many different kinds of relationships. You have people who marry for gain or status. You have people that marry for lust and to get out of bad situations. And you have people who marry because they mutually respect each other and understand each other and also love each other. That obviously being Lizzie and Mr. Darcy at the end of the story. I love the way that Austen is able to bring each of the 5 sisters to life. Even though some of the background sisters, like maybe Kitty and Mary, they're a little bit more tropey than some of the other sisters, they all still have a distinctive personality, and all of them come across as sympathetic, except for maybe Mary, who just seems to be a bit of a killjoy, obviously going to be a spinster. I don't know, Austen seems to be a bit down on that character more than the other sisters, but overall there's a lot of heart to these characters, there's a lot of dimension to them as well. Obviously though, the centrepiece of the story is the witty repartee between Mr. Darcy and Lizzie Bennet, and the way in which Austen explores the titular themes through these two characters. You have, similar to Emma, Lizzie Bennet is a character who thinks quite highly of herself, and she thinks she's quite a good judge of character, and she has a bad experience with Mr. Darcy, and judges him for that. And this causes lots of misunderstood conversations, and her to see him as not a very nice person. Mr. Darcy, on the other hand, is someone who is quite proud, and he does certainly look down on Lizzie Bennet's family, because they're not necessarily the most genteel, shall we say. And so this causes a lot of friction and tension between the two. And that is the centrepiece of the story. And the friction between these two is just a delight to read. The dialogue in this book is just fantastic. Sometimes it can be a bit hard to follow because Austen really doesn't bother all that much with the kind of, he said, she said stuff. She just gives you the dialogue. It almost reads like a script sometimes. And in that way it feels very modern because, more modern stories tend to be more kind of boop, 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 dialogue heavy rather than prose heavy. Pride and Prejudice is probably Austen's funniest novel, I would say, by quite a stretch. Although Emma is also quite funny, I feel like Pride and Prejudice is still the most colourful, the one that's the most entertaining, and also the one that just moves. It's a book that really just, even despite the language of the time, it's a book that is quite fast-paced. Partly because, like I say, of the dialogue focus, but also just the way that Austen writes, her wit, her sharpness, all comes through, even to a modern reader. I think for me, the thing that keeps Pride and Prejudice in third place and not second or first, because although it is without doubt one of Austen's most fun, entertaining, colourful novels, it just lacks a little something. And you can sort of tell that it's still a book that's been written by someone who's younger, who needs to see a bit more, maybe a bit more of the world, I don't know, but it just lacks the kind of bittersweetness and depth and complexity that I think the other two books really sell on. So, still a great book, and again, definitely one to read early in your Austen reads if you haven't read it, because obviously it's her most famous work as well. Okay, my top two, when I had to change my mind quite a few times on this, but second place for me is Mansfield Park. About 30 years ago, Miss Maria Ward of Huntington, with only £7,000, had the good luck to captivate Sir Thomas Bertram of Mansfield Park in the county of Northampton, and to be thereby raised to the rank of a baronet's lady, with all the comforts and consequences of an handsome house and large income. Mansfield Park tells the story of Fanny Price, who is the poor daughter of a family in Portsmouth, until one day she is saved by her wealthy Aunt Bertram and Aunt Norris, and she moves in to Mansfield Park, this glorious estate, and her life sort of changes for the better. She's treated well by this family, but certainly kept as a kind of second-class citizen. She's often looked down upon by her relatives because of her history, especially by her Aunt Norris, who is a very mean, spirited, horrible woman, but also a very entertaining one from a reader's point of view. Fanny grows up and a new family, the Crawfords, come into town, and we have the charming, beautiful, dazzling Mrs. Crawford and the also charming, but ultimately rakish, Mr. Crawford, or Henry Crawford, and these two come into the family life and begin to have a corrupting influence on the family, which Fanny, being a virtuous sort, ultimately she struggles to resist this family, especially when Henry falls in love with her. I think Mansfield Park is such an underrated work. It is probably Austen's most morally ambitious and morally ambiguous works. It's ambitious because it explores not just virtue in Fanny Price, but also some pretty insidious morality through the Crawfords, especially Mary Crawford. In fact, I would say Mansfield Park definitely has the best villains in these two, and especially Mary. She has speeches throughout the story where she's trying to corrupt Fanny and persuade others into her warped worldview. But the thing is, sometimes what she's saying is actually quite charming and quite convincing, and it's not always obvious that Austen is necessarily against Mary Crawford. Even if, at the end of the story, Fanny ultimately triumphs over this family, there is just something in the way that Mary is presented to us that suggests to me a certain kind of ambiguity. And that's what I really like about this story. Another reason why I think this is because the story is called Mansfield Park. It's not called, Virtue and Vice, in the vein of some of the early books, and it's not given Fanny's name. So it's not necessarily a story about her, although she is our principal character. It's a story instead about Mansfield Park, this place, this estate, and the various people that come in. And also the fact that the title is just a place name adds to that sense of ambiguity, because it doesn't give you anything in terms of what to take from the story. So that's why I think it's one of Austen's most ambiguous and morally complex works. I also just think it has some of her best character work as well. A lot of people don't like Fanny Price because they say that she's not sassy enough or whatever, because she doesn't, meet the standards of, modern day, what a woman should be or whatever. But actually, she's a fascinating character. And even if her morality seems to us to be a bit, puritanical and passive, it's a morality that she sticks to. She has principles and she's able to stick to them where other people who might be physically stronger than her or more intelligent than her, they lose their principles in the course of this story. but Fanny is always able to stick to her principles. And so she has a kind of inner strength that is worth respecting, even if, she's not really the sort of person who you might want to go out for dinner with. You probably want to go out for dinner with the Crawfords because you probably have a good time with them. Also, Henry Crawford is a fantastic character. He's someone who's presented to us as another one of Austen's rakish types, but also has a moment where he genuinely seems to consider changing his ways when he falls in love with Fanny, and Austen is able to explore this moral tension with him and even his sister. And ultimately it's kind of sad when they don't get together. It's sad that he ultimately fails in becoming a good person, and sometimes I wonder how much Fanny did play a role in that, in the fact that she didn't choose him in the end, and so he just sort of went back to his ways. It's probably a good thing that she didn't choose him, because probably wouldn't have gone back. He probably would have always stayed the way he was. But again, it's just an interesting avenue in the story that gives Henry Crawford, who could just be presented as a rake, a little bit more depth than a lot of Austen's other rakish characters. And also, like so many of Austen's novels, this is one that just merits rereading. If the first time you read it you just find it boring and you hate Fanny, give it another go, because on my first read, I thought it was fine. It was on my second read that this really started to click, and it was when I really appreciated, say, the Crawfords for the fascinating characters that they are, because I wasn't really focusing all the time on Fanny. I was focusing on these other characters, which, to be honest, even the narrative itself, sometimes you forget that Fanny's there because she's so passive, and the focus really is on these other characters. So just allow yourself to enjoy the complexity of this world that Austen has created. It's definitely a book that is underappreciated, and so if you're one of those people that wrote this one off when you first read it, I urge you to give it a go again, because I think it's just absolutely fantastic. And so if you know what all of Austen's novels are, you'll know that my top choice, my favourite Austen novel, is her final fully completed work anyway, and that is Persuasion. Sir Walter Elliot of Killinch Hall in Somersetshire was a man who, for his own amusement, never took up any book but the baronetage. There he found occupation for an idle hour, and consolation in a distressed one. There his faculties were roused into admiration and respect by contemplating the limited remnant of the earliest patents. There any unwelcome sensations arising from domestic affairs changed naturally into pity and contempt as he turned over the almost endless creations of the last century, and there, if every other leaf were powerless, he could read his own history with an interest which never failed. This was the page at which the favourite volume always opened. Eliot of Killinch Hall. So that introductory sentence is one of Austen's longest opening sentences, which is odd because all of her other books tend to have just this very sharp quickness to them, whereas this one has this very long, somewhat convoluted paragraph. And to me that just reflects the complexity that is on display and the maturity that is on display in Persuasion. It tells the story of Anne Elliot, who is the daughter of Mr. Elliot, the vain man who was just mentioned in the opening, who is a woman who made a mistake 10 years ago. She fell in love with Captain Wentworth and she wanted to marry him. She was persuaded not to marry him because of his low status. I think it's 10 years later or something like that, she comes into contact with Wentworth again. Now she is faded and she's full of regrets, and he is succeeding in life and more handsome than ever, and she has to engage with him once again. And the story explores their relationship as it develops after all this time has passed. Persuasion is probably Austen's saddest novel. A lot of people call it autumnal, and I can certainly see why. It does have the Austen tropes and the Austen humour. Mr. Elliot is a delightfully vain moron. You also have Anne's two sisters. You have the narcissistic Mary, who is younger than Anne, but she's already married, and she loves herself and pretty much no one else, and she also is quite self-pitying. She pretends to be ill so she can get what she wants. Not a very nice person. And then you also have her older sister, who is a stuck-up snob who's her dad's favourite. Not a very nice character. If there's one weakness to the story, maybe it's that these characters don't have all that much depth, but the depth of Anne and Captain Wentworth and some of the other principal characters makes up for that in spades. Anne's character is definitely one of my favourite. I actually think that Austen is better at writing these introspective heroines, because she can really get inside their minds and explore what's going on in there. And I think that Anne is just a fantastic character, and it's one of the reasons why I was so negative in my film review of Persuasion, because I just think they misread the character of Anne, who is someone who is introspective, full of regret, and they, just turned her into this sasspot because that's what people think an Austen heroine should be, I guess. I think I also just gravitate more towards stories, at the minute anyway, that kind of aren't so much about people who are up and coming, and are more stories about people who are reflecting on the past decisions that they made. Maybe that's because I'm almost 30 now, and so I'm starting to do that myself, looking back on my life and being a little bit more reflective than maybe I would have been 10 years ago. So for me, this book is just perfectly placed to do that because it seems to be written for the kind of position in life that I'm at. Also, I just love the ultimate message in this story, which was also butchered by the film. It's when Anne is discussing the nature of constancy in men and women with one of Captain Wentworth's friends. And both of them initially kind of takes the sides of their own sex. And the man thinks that men are more constant than women, whereas women are more fickle, and the woman says that that's not the case, and the reason why men think that is because men have been writing all of the books and have portrayed women that way, and she thinks that women are more constant because men are out doing things in the world, whereas women have to stay at home, and so they can ruminate more on these things. Now, in lesser hands, this would just become a battle of the sexes kind of speech, but ultimately the two characters realise that perhaps men and women are just a little bit hard on each other because they lack proper understanding of each other, and that maybe they should try and have greater understanding of each other rather than assuming the worst of each other, which I think is a wonderful message, one that holds up to this day, and is just a beautiful culmination of this story and of these characters who've made some terrible mistakes and are trying to understand what went wrong. I probably wouldn't recommend Persuasion as the first Austen novel to read, just because it's not an immediate novel. It doesn't have the comedy that's popping in your face. It's quite somber. There are, I think, quite a few, at least, references to dead characters and characters who are quite ill. It's quite dark for Austen anyway. And if anyone tells you that Austen is all just light fluff, which is usually the stereotype, just throw Persuasion at them and tell them to shut up, because she can do depth and she can do something that is a little bit more somber. Even the very end of the story, when Captain Wentworth and Anne get together, there's just this little line that she puts in that suggests that Anne is only as happy as a military wife could be, because of course if you're in the military your husband could be called off into war at any time, and that might very well happen. And so she leaves that little bit of darkness even at the end of an otherwise happy ending to a story. So, it's not all sunshine and roses in the world of Jane Austen. Alright, that is it for my ranking of Jane Austen's works. If you've read the Jane Austen novels, let me know what your ranking is down in the comments. I'd love to discuss that with you. I will be back making more regular videos again now that I'm back from holiday, so I will see you all in the next video. Ta-ra!